Did you know there are people who seem to know events before they happen, as if they can peer into a future no one else can see? One such case involves a man from a quiet town in northern England, known simply as Edward M., who appeared entirely ordinary until subtle, impossible things began to surface. Edward worked as a local clerk, a man whose life was defined by routine. Yet, neighbors began noticing unusual behavior. He would speak of storms that hadn't yet appeared, of fires in distant towns, or of accidents that seemed entirely random, and in every instance, they happened exactly as he described. Friends first dismissed it as coincidence, until it became impossible to ignore. He started showing an uncanny understanding of places he had never visited. Old maps that lay in archives for decades, long-forgotten factories, and abandoned railway stations. Edward could point to rooms, corridors, even hidden doorways, with a certainty that astounded local historians. On one occasion, he drew a detailed floor plan of a sealed mine, predicting the collapse of a tunnel section that had remained untouched for over 50 years. No one had shared that information with him. Edward's reactions to objects and locations were equally strange. He would become visibly agitated at certain street names or building numbers, sometimes muttering phrases that sounded like warnings. At times, he traced symbols on walls in old, disused schools or factories, insisting they meant something he couldn't yet explain. Symbols that, when researched later, were linked to failed industrial projects or long-abandoned village layouts. The turning point came one foggy morning in an abandoned coastal fort. Edward had insisted he needed to see a particular turret, though it had been cordoned off by authorities decades earlier. When they arrived, he walked directly to a narrow, hidden staircase, descending as if guided by memory rather than sight. At the base, he paused, staring at a rusted chest tucked into a corner. Inside were weathered documents, detailed reports of a storm that had destroyed nearby towns decades ago, reports that had never been publicly archived. Edward had described their contents perfectly before even seeing them. The mystery deepened in his home. He began keeping small journals, filled with predictions that were eerily precise. Entire pages described events in towns hundreds of miles away. Floods, fires, even structural failures in buildings he had never visited. Some entries matched newspaper clippings that only surfaced days or weeks later. Investigators and journalists who attempted to trace his sources found no link, no news leaks, no insider tips, no prior access. One evening, a researcher followed Edward to a closed railway station. The air was heavy and the tracks were coated with rust. Edward stopped in front of a locked signal room, whispering the same sentence over and over. "It's coming back. It will return." Before anyone could ask what he meant, he pressed his hand to the metal door, and it swung open silently. Inside was a map of the local region, with marks Edward had never drawn before, showing lines and connections that mirrored the layout of streets, rivers, and railways decades into the future. The final unsettling moment occurred when Edward vanished in the middle of a small town square. Witnesses reported seeing him look up at the sky and whisper one word, barely audible: "Soon." Then he was gone. Not running, not hiding, simply gone. A few moments later, an inexplicable gust of wind swept through, leaving a faint metallic scent in a single folded page lying in the street. It bore a warning of a disaster that would strike the town, though no one could say when or how, and Edward never returned to clarify. What happened to him? Was he seeing into the future, or uncovering hidden truths that the rest of us cannot comprehend? The evidence remains, the predictions remain, but Edward's presence, and his knowledge, vanished as quietly as it had appeared. And some nights, when the wind whispers through the empty streets of that northern town, locals claim they can hear him murmuring warnings once more.